Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of An Evening with the Philosophical Muse. I've really been enjoying doing these shows, and I'm delighted to have my dear friend Ian Nettleton, best man at my wedding and long-term journeyer with me on the Christian faith. And I thought it'd be nice to get together with Ian because we had such a journey together at the beginning when I became a Christian, and I realize that it's been uh, I've lived half my life as a Christian and half as a non-Christian. I'm 46, so as the Americans say, you do the math. But yeah, 23 years of and I think it's been an interesting journey from two different perspectives. And Ian, you played such a crucial part in my coming to faith, which we could talk about. I thought might be nice to,
Sorry about that.
yeah, you've so much to answer for. You've uh, you've helped transform me, and yeah, there's all sorts of things to reflect on. So let's do that. So Ian, tell us, for people who don't know you, tell us about yourself. What are the salient things that we need to know about Ian Nettleton?
Wow. Well, when I was one, no, I'm joking. I don't know. I mean, you can tell obviously I've got an accent, as you spotted when we first met at County Hall, working in the post room.
Mm,
You noticed that I got a kind of Midlands accent. I think you know, somebody from Derby in your family, I think, somewhere like
yeah, yeah.
that. I mean, my family are from Sheffield, and I'm kind of Sheffield, Derbyshire, although I was born in Swindon. So obviously got a northern accent, but I've been in Norwich for quite a while. I would say 25 years, 26 years, and it's yeah. I mean, like yourself, I've gone through a lot of changes in that time. It wasn't long, not that long after I moved here that I met you in the post room. But I came here to study at the UEA postgrad, doing creative writing, and I only intended to be here for a few years, but other things happened as they do, life, you know, and I'm still here. And yeah, and I teach creative writing. That's my main job, and I also write. And it's been a very interesting time. Norwich is a great place to live, close to the
Mm.
coast as well. I only have used to see the seaside once a year, so now I can go anytime I want. It's only half an hour up the road, which is wonderful.
Yeah,
That's,
it's a great place to be a writer, isn't it?
yes,
The
it is.
Norfolk coast and
Mm.
the atmosphere and the city with its history.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, what a story, really. I reflect on it so often, and I think what an amazing time it's been. So, for those that don't know, when I think the point at meeting you was a really interesting fork in the road because I was living the life, I was gambling, I didn't have already need a job at that time, um, and this is it's fascinating how God works. One day I got this call from the centre at Kiln House, and they asked me to come in for a meeting to register for national insurance. It had come up on the system that I was a bit of an anomaly because I was sort of self-sufficient and I wasn't, claiming anything or paying anything out really in that context. So I visited this for this meeting. I had a bit of banter with the lady who was doing the interviewing and stuff, and she said, "Would you like to go for a job interview at County Hall in the microfilm section?" Now, every single fiber of my being really should have said no to that. There was no, I didn't want to, I didn't need to. And yet, looking back, it was clear at the time, it was clear in retrospect, but at the time, something more powerful than me was pushing me to say yes. And I said yes, and I went to the interview, and against all odds, really, I decided to give it a shot. And I think subconsciously I was thinking, well, there's you can't do what I'm doing forever. You need more stability. You need to, buy a house and get a mortgage and stuff and all that sort of thing. So, and it wasn't a very healthy lifestyle, I suppose, to some extent. So, yeah, and then we met, as you say, you were in the post area, I was in the microfilm, and I sort of had commonality with the two managers. And yeah, it was God bringing me to the place He wanted me to be. A very, profound fork in the road moment. And yeah, we just hit it off with our love of great art and music and film and literature and stuff, didn't we? And that you always know when you have a fellow like-minded person who can, sort of vibrate to each other's likes and
Yeah.
tastes, and yeah, it was remarkable, wasn't it?
Well, we fell into conversation straight away, didn't we? I mean, I think one of the first I mean, when you first met me, I was a bit grumpy because I'd had an argument with my manager, and
Mm,
so I apologies to her if she's listening. And so I wasn't in a very good mood, and I think I don't think your first impression of me wasn't the best, but not long afterwards, I remember I for some reason asked you. I said, James, have you what I didn't know anything about you, so I decided to ask you, have you seen The Third Man? I mean, it's an obvious question to ask, isn't it? Of course, have you seen? Of course, you had, and that was it. That was the beginning, wasn't it? We just
mm,
talked from there. We haven't stopped, actually, really, have we? I mean, the conversations we've had, the hours and hours, if they were all recorded and transcribed, would fill many
wow,
books.
wow.
Yeah, it was, and it was a turning point in my life as well. I just got my arm out of a sling, having broken my collarbone, and I'd returned to church very, very reluctantly. That's not changed that much, but I guess my faith has changed, yeah, somewhat since that time. So I wasn't in the best of places, but we met in a similar kind of place in a way. I think. I mean,
Mm,
you weren't thinking about faith stuff at all, I don't think, but I was very much on the periphery, and that's a place that I seem to kind of gravitate towards, periphery of faith, but it's there, and that seemed to kind of fit quite well with the fact that you were kind of in that same kind of place. It didn't seem that different. I used to say to you, I remember quoting from the Smiths, James, my son, get your vile soul dry cleaned, if you remember.
mm.
And it was my indirect way, because I use literature and film and whatever to talk about faith and that, and that's what I used to say to you, I remember. So,
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, when you join a new character, there was something exciting, isn't there? Often
mm,
something exciting when you get a book or a film, and there's a new meeting, there's a new season, there's something happening that's new for
mm,
the person, and that happens probably more often than not, really, doesn't it, to some extent? And yeah, it really was at the time. There's a great line from Hegel. He says the owl of Minerva doesn't take wing until dusk, and it's a quote about epochs and different and the ways that we retrospectively analyze
mm,
what's happened,
yeah,
but you have to go through it and live it to understand that it was an epoch, and
yeah,
that's I think true of seasons too. And I had no idea that this was such a brand new chapter of such radical proportions. And I guess also it teaches you the 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 immediacy of the present isn't necessarily indicative of what's to come. Because when I first arrived, as you say, you were in a really difficult place you're in a bad mood with the manager's incident you'd had earlier, and of course I could never have imagined from our first encounter when you sort of blanked me a bit
mm.
because you were really blanking the person who was introducing
Yes,
us,
I
which was
was.
the
Yes,
which was
yeah,
the
that's
manager.
right.
Um, I couldn't have imagined what a great friendship would emerge from it on that first impression. But equally, the manager who I was under um, had left me a manual to read because she'd gone to the dentist that morning. So my first morning, she wasn't there, and so she left me with this rather boring microfiche manual to read. Again, apologies if you're watching too. Um, and I couldn't believe what I was doing in this place. I thought, what am I doing? I feel so mortified that I'm sitting here with a job reading something that I'm not remotely interested in. But of course, I'm sure God was having a chuckle because it turned out to be, the key, one of the key catalysts in leading me to where I'd be. And of course, for those that don't know, I had a really good crowd for the Friday night drinking nights, which were fantastic. I had great conversations. We used to love those nights, and you had a good crowd. The church, the Holy Trinity at the time, they had a good mix of people. So there was plenty of potential, wasn't there, for the groups to converge, and you and I both being social dynamos. I like yourself. I draw my energy from people and from interactions. I'm a big extrovert, and yeah, we started to converge, didn't we? And we had an interesting sort of a bet, but it was more like a deal we struck, didn't we? Do you want to tell them about the deal we struck?
Yes, I remember. I remember you said to me, "I'll tell you what, I'll come to church with you on Sunday evening if you then come to was it Liquid? It was Liquid,
Yeah,
wasn't it? The nightclub down Prince Wales Road."
yeah.
And I yes, okay, yeah, yeah, and yep. So you came along to Trinity, and how do I say this for anyone who goes to Trinity? I mean, it wasn't the most exhilarating of services, but I think, is it fair to say you found it a bit boring? Was it? Maybe, is that all right to say that?
No, I
I
didn't.
don't think.
I didn't mind it.
Oh, you didn't mind it.
The
I,
funniest thing about it was you next to me.
yes, you thought I was deep in contemplation. I got my head down, but I was actually asleep.
Yeah, I thought this man. Wow, he's in a deep prayer, and I better not disturb him. And wow, this
Yes,
what's God doing in this moment? But
yeah. God was. If He was speaking to me, it was in my dreams. So that was. So I frequently used to fall asleep at Trinity, and I think I was known for it. I guess I just had too many late nights. It was probably anyway. Yes, and then we then went on to the nightclub, and I don't think you particularly enjoyed it. And I had a great time. It was a famous DJ was in at the time, I think, and I quite enjoyed it. Yeah, so that was. I think I won on both counts really, whereas it wasn't as good an evening for you. I think. Nevertheless, you came along, which was interesting. I mean, the thing of it is, to be fair, James, and I mean, I only ever want to be honest about it. I mean, some of the best people I've ever met, I met at church. I mean, I met my wife at church, and I think probably because she relates so well to people who don't fit, kind of thing, and that's probably why I got on so well with her. Part of the reason, anyway. Obviously, I fancied it as well, and still do. Is a self sharing, but but the fact of it is, and always has been, I think, certainly for me, that there's some strange kind of sometimes disconnect between what happens in a church and then what happens in faith. Certainly for me, and I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the common denominator thing. Maybe it's you have to kind of reach the majority of people, and but you don't reach the people who have got slightly more unusual needs or inclinations or points of view. But I never fitted in. I never did, and I actually just accepted that, and I thought that was all right. So me falling asleep was very common, and I often through sermons as well. I did hear some of them, but I think I probably missed at least half of the ones. But there you go. But that I don't think is necessarily a problem, and I've realised as time's gone by that actually that's where I fit is in not fitting in not fitting in the center of these things. Sorry, I'm a bit rambly there, but there you go. Anyway, it was an interesting time. What I think is interesting is that what you said about epochs and turning points. I know that I mean, yeah, I teach creative writing and I talk about plotting and I talk about stories, the two different things, but the whole thing about people look for patterns, they're playing at you and that kind of thing in real life. But in stories, of course, there's a form, there's a structure, and we look for certain ways. If someone tells a story in the pub, even if they're telling a story about something that really happened, they shape it. They miss out the boring bits. If they don't, they're not they're not very interesting stories. So,
Hmm.
we do that all the time. Nevertheless, I think I've been aware throughout my life of turning points, and I've known they're turning points, and I've known that something is coming, and it's usually where life completely changes. And when you turned up at County Hall and came along to Trinity, and when I turned up at Trinity, I knew that everything I'd lived up till then had changed. I'd lost the whole time, whole kind of life, and I know you had as well. I mean, I felt like it had been taken from me, and I was furious.
Hmm.
I was apoplectic at times, particularly when I had a drink. But I knew it was a change, and I didn't want it. And these things happen every now and then. And I do think this is, I mean, for my experience, long before I went to church when I was before I was when I was a kid, before we ever went to church, I believed in God, and I always felt there was a narrator. There was some sort of, some people don't believe that. Well, it's up to them. That's fine. But these experiences, regardless of whatever point I'm at, always make me believe there is a narrator. There's some sort of higher power, if you like. And if there
Hmm.
isn't, well, then it certainly makes it interesting, at the very least. But there's too much there for me, and it is part way looking back, but often also knowing as things are about to change sometimes, almost like a kind of foreshadowing. That's what we call it in writing fiction.
Hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, that's all a bit abstract. I do apologize. I went rambling on a bit.
Not at all. It's yeah, it's that thing where you start to realize something bigger is happening than the more straightforward narrative you might be used to. I mean, remember, um, it is a supernatural encounter. It's some. It gave me a lot of reassurance because I'm comfortable with open-endedness, but I also love it when something is truthful and it shows itself to be truthful. And
Yeah.
I I remember when I first discovered in the New Testament when Paul said, that only those who have the Spirit can say Jesus is Lord. And I thought, yeah, that's something interesting because it gives us an anchor. It gives us something to say, well, actually, what you're experiencing is a supernatural transformation.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, as you say, it started to show itself to be more and more interesting. I love that Puddleglum's speech in Narnia where he says, if suppose we've only made up this stuff, the trees and the grass and sun and whatever it is, and Aslan himself, maybe we've made up Aslan, and he says these things seem a good deal more important and interesting than the real these made up worlds seem more important and interesting than the real ones that you think of in terms of secular. And what does he say that we're just, I think it's we're four babies making up a game, if you're right, but four babies playing a game can make a play world that say licks your world whole. I love that, and he says i'm on I'm on Aslan's side even if there is no Aslan. And I think, and I remember writing after I became a Christian, I know I'm jumping ahead a bit, but I remember writing an article for Network Norwich saying even if Christianity isn't true, I'd still follow Christ's way,
Mm.
because it seemed to me at the time that it was the blueprint for how to live the kind of life that we've all been trying to live. And yes, there is some resistance, and as you say, like yourself, I always feel more at home on the margins because I think I believe it'll turn out to be that they were really much closer to the center than we
Yeah. I get
than
that.
we than we than we thought. But yeah, so your introduction to Trinity, it then led to our great discussions we were having with Mr. Dave Thornton,
Yes.
our dear friend, and Neil. Must forget Neil. Neil was
Yes.
it was a perfect blend because it had you, the literary creative writer. It had Dave, who was the youth worker, but very very well established and disciplined and very
Mm.
knowledgeable in the faith, and still to this day one of the
Yeah.
most godlike Christians I think I've ever met and could meet. and Neil was his background in science, and all of those things are interesting to me. And um, I was the only one who didn't necessarily, didn't know Jesus, but I wasn't necessarily an unbeliever, but I wasn't a
Hmm.
believer in the sense that I am now. And I thought a lot about that, about what I actually was before I became a Christian. That's a very complex tale as well. But yeah, I remember the night that I became a Christian. I remember it so vividly. Dave used to pray for, because if you recall, we met as a foursome for some time, but if you and Neil went your separate ways or came far less often for various reasons, um, and it was left with Dave and myself every other Thursday, I think it was at the time. I used to take fish and chips around and have discussions, and there would be times when he would say he when I've left, he'll pray for me, and I never really minded that. I thought it was a nice thing, but I didn't really feel the full sense that I'd feel the full impact of that. But it was definitely something about what he was saying, and that night when it was just the two of us, that key night, it must have been at least autumn or possibly winter because it was dark and it wasn't that late. Um, and he asked, could I pray for you? And for the first time ever, I was apprehensive. Not sure if I've told you that, but for the first time, I felt something might happen here. And because I felt that, I then thought, well, I must have a stronger sense of God than I realize, or perhaps I'm willing to admit. And he prayed for me, and I went outside, and my car was parked outside his house, which doesn't always happen because it's a very busy street. But I was right outside his house, and I came out, and I looked up at the top of the hill, which had a lovely pub on it and a really good backdrop, and it was twilight, and it was amazing light. And I'm not the sort of person who overinterprets visions for vision's sake. But that was the moment when God chose to impart the Holy Spirit. And it was like, in the opticians when they put the glasses on and they go better, worse, better, worse. You've seen that, haven't you? Um, and they make it better. And you go, yeah, that's the one. I can see the bottom line now.
Yeah.
It was like that. It was like, everything that I'd been interested in. It's not like it was necessarily wrong. It was underdeveloped, perhaps. I was very interested in psychology, and all sorts of philosophy and science, but it came into focus in an astounding way. Like what's that T.S. Eliot line? Where at the end of our exploring, we'll arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Well, of course, it wasn't the end of the exploring, but it was. Yeah, it was real, and as you know, these parts of the journey they create a narrative, and they are real experiences. They're not, they're not made up. They're happening to real people.
Well, absolutely. I always find it kind of. I mean, I entirely understand um, why people um, don't get on with the idea of faith, Jesus. There are all sorts of things in the way, all sorts of caricatures and ideas and straw man. I remember you talking about this straw man kind of thing. This picture people have. This is what they attack. This idea of Christianity, etc. And it's the very thing that I've kicked against, but I understand it from the outside and the inside in a slightly different way to yourself. In that, before I went to Trinity, I had a faith when I was younger. I even went to theological college for a year, which was one of the worst. Sorry, theological college that I went to, but it was one of the worst years of my life. It was pretty horrendous in lots of ways, although I met some lovely people. But I didn't go to church, or I was away from the whole thing for 10 years or more, and I had a great time, got to say, but also had a bad time And I understand and understood then, what it was like to look from the outside in and think, what, what is it that these people are talking about? And so in my experience, I genuinely felt like I've been dragged back. I mean, I used literature was, I mean, you mentioned C.S. Lewis. One of the most useful illustrations of, pictures of Jesus is because I always had problems saying his name, and I still struggle with it. Was Aslan, where they say, oh, he's a lioness. Oh, is he safe? Oh no, but he's good.
It's good.
Now,
Yeah.
that was my way of starting to be able to accept. But there's a great line from Emily Dickinson when she says, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." I've talked to you about that before, and I think that's what you do. We use stories. This is why stories are so important for literature, film, whatever. To look at the same thing and look at it again and again in a new and fresh way. And the problem I always had, and still do have, is the caricatures and the kind of the language that is so commonly used that doesn't seem to really get the essence of what it is that actually makes the difference. Whereas
Mm.
literature and film, etc., I always had to find that, that was always the thing that was important to me. Um, so the problem I had when coming back was I was hearing the same language again, and the same kind of sermons and the same way of being, and people living a certain way, like they thought like a fear-based idea of this is what I ought to be as a Christian, a person with a faith. And it didn't make any sense to me because I'd been in that world before. And when I came back, I thought, I'm not accepting any number of these things that I used to put up with because I thought I ought to be like this. I thought if there's any reality to this, I only want the real. You said about truth, and there's that
Mm.
John Lennon, all I want is some truth, just give me some truth. And it's like it's a just give me some truth, will you? Stop coming out with platitudes and language and sappy stuff that just doesn't work. I mean, maybe it works for some people, but you think, how many people are really going for this? But the reality is a different thing. And I've found that through literature, film, etc. Because I had to find a new way back to this thing. And of course, like you described, James, I mean that, yeah, like the view, suddenly seeing things in a new way. I mean, it took me quite a while, and I think it was after your experience. You kind of it was like we're in a race, and you've gone past. You were absolutely this stuff was really working for you and very real for you, whereas I was still resentful and angry.
Mm.
I'll just a good illustration of it. Graham Greene was always a really important writer to me because he wrote about people who didn't fit and didn't belong, and yet despite themselves, there was this grain of a belief, a little bit like Cardinal Newman, where it says, "If there is a God, since there is a God, it seems to me that we're caught in some terrible aboriginal calamity. There's this dislocation, like this, and that's a reckoning. Like for me, it was like the only way I could find at that point a belief in God was in the sense of His absence, like there's something missing." And that was the kind of faith I could relate to. And that was the kind of faith when I talked to my friends who were atheists, hard atheists, soft atheists, whatever that means, and agnostics. And a lot of them, some of my best friends are atheists and agnostics. When I talked about it in these terms, they understood that, but they couldn't get the way that people talked about faith. They couldn't get it. And I don't blame them, which is,
Mm.
I find it remarkable. I find it staggering. But that made sense to me. So there was this tempered faith. And there was a book and a film, Graham Greene, which is The End of the Affair. And I remember
Mm.
going to see the film of the book, which I thought was very good, Neil Jordan film. And I've got to spoil the film for you if you haven't seen it. So if you don't want to know, put your
Oh,
fingers in your
yeah,
ears.
I know it. I know it.
I
Yeah.
don't mean you, I mean anyone listening.
Oh, I
So,
see. Yes,
yeah,
yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. Well, there's a bit where Bendrix, I think it is, he because it's set during the war, and he's with his lover, and she's a Catholic, and he's an atheist, and a bomb goes off, and he's killed. And she says to God, "If you bring him back,
Mm.
I will dedicate my life to you, and I will give up this affair." And then he walks into the bedroom, and it's
Yeah,
gets me now. Actually, it was
it's
like,
amazing. Yeah.
yeah, and I felt because he comes to a faith in the end, Bendrix. At least he believes in God through hating him, and it's like a reverse way. And I thought, yeah, that's something I can relate to because I hated God, not all the time, but I did. I hated him for taking away what I had and what I wanted, and it felt like it's like he says, Bendrix says to her, well, you know, surely, you know, if you love me, then it doesn't matter what you've decided with God. And she says, but don't you see, you know, maybe. So I was like, she had no choice, and I felt that was how I felt towards God. But it was like I came to acknowledge God through being angry and hating Him. So I really related to that story, and and it took me a while longer until that point came where there was a bigger turning point. And what it was when I was a kid, we started going to church when I was about 9, and at this point my family had kind of broken up, and my dad was bringing us up, me and my 2 sisters, and he came to a faith, and we went to church. And now, hang on, what was the point here? There's a reason for this. That's right. I couldn't stand anyone kind of praying for me and putting a hand on me, like, you know, laying a hand on me or anything like that. And sometimes people would do that, and I couldn't stand it. And I realized that all the way back then I was angry because of what had happened. And yet it was a wonderful time in my life. And I couldn't stand the idea of kneeling. I stand the idea of saying I'm not worthy and all this kind of stuff. And then one night I do remember, I just felt like God was saying, don't you get it? I don't want you on your knees. It's a bit like in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where God says, "Oh, you know, I'm not worthy," and this, it's so boring. You know, where his face appears in the clouds, and that's brilliant. And I thought, yeah, it was like that. You know, it wasn't animated by Terry Gilliam, but it was that kind of thing.
Hmm.
And it was like God was saying, "I want you to stand up. I want you to be who I always wanted you to be," and it utterly knocked me to. I mean, I was just couldn't believe it. There's been other experiences, but that was a really profound moment for me, to realize it's not turning into some sort of sap, some sort of, you know, tank top wearing, Jesus sandals wearing, softly spoken, you know, fear-based kind of person. You know what I mean? And that's no use to me at all. I'm not interested in that. And I don't blame anyone for being an atheist if they think that's what they've got to become. But that was the thing for me. I got it. I suddenly thought, no, this is something else. And that was transformative. And it changed my life, literally changed at that point. There have been other turning points, but it was quite fantastic, and things came into focus. And at that moment, after that, I went to the back of the church, and I was talking to a person who I really liked, who is now my wife. And it's like suddenly we were in the same country. It's like we were suddenly in the same country. It was really, really curious. So yeah, I mean, people could knock that kind of thing or say, well, you know, this or that or the other, but that experience is profound, and no language, no promises, no choruses or hymns or whatever, you know, and sappy stuff would convince me the way that did. But that was, you know, foundation shaking. Anyway, over to you, James.
Yeah, I totally agree. I recall when I learned about the Greek for when Jesus talks about meek and mild.
Yeah.
It's not, you know, as you say, it's not some kind of sappy individual who can't, you know, stand up to anything. It's the epitome of what Jesus calls for there. It's as though somebody's got a weapon and they're in control enough not to use it. It's in a sense, it's the epitome of a strong, you know, you feel safe with someone who's strong and gentle. You know, there's a great book by what's her name, Francine Rivers. It's Redeeming Love. It's based on the Old Testament book of Hosea, which as you probably know, he went through all sorts of difficult times with his lady, the prostitute who he married, and that's obviously an allegory of Israel's unfaithfulness. And you know that there's a strong man, a man of God who knows how to protect and knows how to defend, but is also under authority. And I think, yeah, you talk about that resistance, and I think it's a curious thing, isn't it? There are two, one from Freud and one from Jung. There are two competing forces in a sense. The Freud Freud had what's called the narcissism of small differences, that you can agree on almost everything, but that one little thing you disagree on can be strong enough to form a subgroup, and another hierarchy's formed, and another a rivalry, and we've seen that countless times throughout history. And Jung's idea was the idea of what he called enantiodromia, which is the idea of competing opposites. It's like the tension that occurs. It's based on the yin yang in the I Ching as well. The when something becomes so extreme at one end, it can be transformative. Like for example, I don't know, we see with people who've been involved in very extreme war crimes often end up being really strongly pacifist, and they end up trying to be peacekeepers. And people who've been addicted to drugs and in gang cultures often go right the other extreme and have a really profound conversion and stuff like that. And yeah, absolutely, it's as we've often said, it's just about being authentic. It doesn't matter where you've come from. All that matters to me, and all that should matter, I think, and I think all that matters to God here, is that the person's authentic. They're expressing themselves, and they're telling us their story without embellishments, without any artifice.
Yeah.
And it's on those grounds that we can take people, and they're the people we're drawn to. And I think that's why the gospel is so alluring too, because it gives us truth on its own terms. It doesn't, the people talk about the religious faith, the Marxism, opium.
Oh, opium, the masses kind of,
the masses, and that it's a crutch. Well, if you want to have your ego stroked, and if you want to go to somewhere for comfort, don't go to Christianity. Don't go to the New Testament, because it's not where you'll find it. And the same people, there's a cognitive dissonance too, because the same people who are in one conversation are telling us it's just a crutch, just a wish fulfillment, are the same people on the other hand who are saying, oh, that God of the Bible, he's so barbaric, it held such an awful thing. And it's the mess of contradictions in skepticism that really do, I think, pull it up from under its feet. And I think a world of opposites is a really interesting place. There's a great quote from Niels Bohr, which I really love. It's one of my favorite quotes. And he says, the opposite of a fact is a falsehood, but the opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth. And I really like that. I think that's, Christianity is actually, and I write about this in chapter 1 of my book on God's genius. It is all these different profound things that do appear superficially a little bit contradictory. I mean, what does Jesus say? My burden is light, my yoke is easy, but also he says, take up your cross. It's going to be, a journey of intense hardship for obvious reasons. And both of those things are true, and both of those things are true in different contexts as well. But they're also both true simultaneously. You can suffer for your faith, suffer for your beliefs, and it can bring color and flavor to the suffering of the world. And yet it is a tremendous relief, and it's also a tremendous liberation to be under that kind of relationship, and yeah, I like the idea of profound opposites. What is Jung also says? He says, this is a great quote. He says, you can't grow a tree to heaven unless its roots stretch all the way down to hell. Isn't that amazing? It's like, wow.
Yeah.
It's the belly of the whale in Jonah. It's submerging itself. It's confronting the shadow, the things inside us that we don't want to confront.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest um, contention really I've had with unbelievers, which is goes back to what you were saying. It's not the ones that are resisting and fighting against it and have good arguments and have, it's probably the people that ridicule it or trivialize it by just not by having this sort of blithe indifference. I think the conversations aren't as compelling. I invited on my shows previously. I've had various guests, and I've had someone from Extinction Rebellion on, and I've had someone from Just Stop Oil on. And I'm quite furious with these guys. And I thought there'd be quite a bit of confrontation. Obviously, as you know, I'm quite a charming gentleman. So I like to make people feel at ease. But I did think I have issues with what they're doing, and I thought there would be, a bit more of a to and fro. But actually, both those conversations were very cordial. They were interesting, and I made my points, they made their points. We didn't have any cross words.
Mm.
And I think there are probably two things about that. One is that it's that thing about being face to face with a person and treating them as a person and them treating me as a person. And it's easy to rant on Twitter or Facebook to the sort of two-dimensional other that you. But it's that sense of person. But the other thing I think as well is that although I disagreed, it was two people being authentic. They were kind enough to agree to come on the show, and it felt wrong to give them a whole barrage of mega criticism. It was more of an exercise in listening, and I think there's quite a salutary lesson there about the engaging of people and the authentic self coming together with another authentic self. And actually, they were quite reasonable discussions.
And that's interesting. Recently, I mean, I'm not going to Trinity now. I'm going to St. Catherine's, and what I really appreciate about the place is, a number of things. And one of the things is that the guy who runs the place, the minister, he says that the first time I met him, he said we're working things out, and it's a conversation, and he's not kind of. I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but this is my impression: is that it's a conversation, and that's what it should be. Because I can't. There are things I don't believe within the Christian faith. I balk at calling myself a Christian. I'd say I have a faith, but I know that it's in the Christian faith. It's semantics or whatever. But it's what you prefer, and it doesn't matter. And someone once said to me, "Well, you're trying to convert me." I said, "God forbid," And I think it was my atheist friend. But it's a conversation and has to be, and I think that's how it should be in the end. I think I was talking to a friend in Edinburgh who she may watch this, so hi if you do. And I remember talking to her about faith late into the night as we drank whiskey and that, and she's great. And she wasn't sure where things were. I don't want to say too much about her circumstances, but she wasn't sure about a lot of this stuff. But the thing that really worked for her was when I quoted. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's a misquote, actually. It's not exactly this, but it's words to this effect. And I've told you this before. From W. Somerset Maugham, who was he wrote a story called The Judgment Seat, where a philosopher argues with God that he can't be just and merciful. Is it just and loving? I think it is one of the other, which is what you were talking about, that kind of apparent dichotomy, etc. And I understand why people struggle with it. Of course I do. I'm a human being, I have problems with the idea of judgment and whatever. I really do. Anyway, at the end, I won't go into the whole story, but basically what it is that the great being or God, whoever it is in this story, he tells it there are these three people who do the right thing but for the wrong reasons. It's like it's a love triangle, but they stay chaste, but they're bitter. And I thought that it's a really story. It's a story within the story. And God says, it sometimes seems to me that the stars shine no brighter than when reflected in a wayside ditch. And that is where, certainly before I went back to church and certainly afterwards, that is where I found it. I always remember in again, Graham Greene, my favorite novel for long enough was A Burnt Out Case, about a priest who goes to the Congo and to this leper colony, and he's lost all faith. And now I've forgotten what point I was making. What was the point? I guess it's this is good, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. He says the minister in the priest in A Burnt Out Case says, I only had to sleep with someone to convert them. Now there are a lot of people who would say, what? How can that? How could that possibly match with, with the idea of what Christianity is and what you should be as a Christian and all that kind of stuff? And my experience has been, without going into great detail, and I'm not talking about that particular issue, but I have found myself in the most, well, not most unholy. I haven't been in a Satanist place talking about God, but it's finding that the surprise of finding God in the most unexpected of places and having a sense of Him in a way that that defies what you would think of as being what this faith thing is about. There's another thing in Dallas Buyers Club where the guy, he's found he's HIV positive and he's a real macho guy and from Texas, and he's up close like this and he's desperate and he's praying and the candle's in front of him. You think, well, he must be in church, and he's saying, I just give me a sign. I need a sign. And then the camera kind of pulls back and there's someone half naked dancing on the bar, and he's actually at a lap dancing club. And he does get an answer, which is somebody sells him these drugs that they're bringing over that are illegal from Mexico, and it prolongs his life, and he starts selling them or giving them to the gay community in particular. And it's a turning point. Now, I guess if I'm making a point here, it's that it's so much more, in some ways, complicated and yet a lot more simple. I always think it's both those things. And your idea of roots in hell and thing into heaven and that, it's something that people can relate to, and there are different ways for them to relate to it. And I guess the problem I have with, and I can't remember what started all of this off, so I'm kind of meandering a bit here. Hope someone who's listening to this does follow the idea that this is what it's about. This thing. This is and there's a fear of, how about if someone is in bed with someone and talks to them about God? Well, that can't be all right, Yeah, but you don't want to allow for that. What if this person is bisexual or gay or whatever? It's a conversation. That's it. That's what it is. And I just think that's the thing. It's so easy to. I mean, I wouldn't dare to say, what a person should or shouldn't do. I mean, there are certain things that are crossing boundaries, like obvious things. I mean, you don't go around shooting people, whatever, that kind of stuff. But the complexity of human life and how fascinating it is, and to limit and reduce something that is profound, to a number of kind of almost often middle class ideas of, in this country anyway, of what it is, evangelical Christianity. It's a travesty, and people can't relate to that. They just can't, and I know I can't. And what's the point? And I don't blame them. I only believe because of the truth, my idea of what I think of as truth, or a sense of it, or as close to as I can get. I'm conscious all the time that I try to be truthful, but I know I'm not always truthful, and I think my wife is a lot more truthful. She seems to, and she can tell when I'm not being truthful, and you can tell when someone's got a card up their sleeve, or they're trying to sell you something. They're trying to be pally and that, but really they're and like that. Let's say the authenticity. What are we worried about? If this is true, what are we worried about? if there is something here that is real, why are we worried? What are we trying to protect? Are we worried that someone's going to get pushed in the wrong direction? It's a nonsense, and I can't abide it. Why not just see how, it's not even setting out, and this is sorry, it's not even setting out to be authentic. It's not trying to be authentic. It's just thinking, what's the point in not being? What's the point in not saying this is something, and you don't get it? That's fine. Okay, let's have a drink, talk about something else. Let's, but it's so complicated and it's so exciting. My I won't say who it is, but there's somebody who I think a lot of, who's very young, and struggles with the idea of the Bible and finds it boring. Someone who's very dear to me, and this person is very creative, wildly imaginative, questioning stuff about gender and everything. And I was talking to this person, and they were saying how boring it all seems. And I said, yeah, but I said, I don't blame you. I said, and I used to think it's really, but the things that changed my mind about it, I said, but what about, when Jesus died on the cross, after his death, dead people were seen walking around Jerusalem. It says that in the New Testament. She went, oh, that's really exciting. That really appealed to her because it's, no one ever talks about that. No one ever talks about that. And there are so many things about it that are utterly fascinating. Also, I realized that the language, okay, it's a translation of the King James version, and King James, of course. The certainly, as far as I know, I think he was gay, and I just think it's great that all these people who are homophobic and worry about it, in the church. The person who created their great version of the Bible was gay, and I think that's there you go. Forget about all these ideas. It's just not what these people want it to be and try to make it be and worry about. But what a great language. And I realized when reading Cormac McCarthy, who's one of my favorite writers, and the ambiguity in his language. He says before man was, war was waiting for him. He talks about it. Just that's one of the things he puts. It's like this force that's there, and this consciousness of the power and these forces that are there. And his language is very influenced by the King James version and the and Herman Melville and one writer, Southern Gothic writer whose name I always struggle to remember, and I can't remember. I don't know why. And I realized just what power there is in this language and why tame it. Why water it down? Why interpret it in a way that is very clearly agenda led? I mean, a line like "I will enter," I will enter in and eat with him and he with me. You've got tautology there. Now, you shouldn't use tautology. It's I will enter in. Well, you don't enter in. You don't enter out, do you? But what great language! I will enter in and eat with him and he with me. It's terrific. I don't know the original language. I've looked at some of the Greek, but and when you start looking at it and forget about these people, I'm trying to think of the right word without swearing, going on about it. Well, what word do you want in there? And managing to turn it into the most dull thing. It staggers me. Sorry, James, this is not necessary, but you've heard this many times before. But my two favorite bits of the Old and the New Testament. My favorite bit of the Old Testament is where Jacob wrestles with God, and he won't let go of him until he blesses him. But God puts his hip out of joint, and I think that's a bit mean. But I love that he wrestles with God. Israel means he wrestles with God. I think that's fantastic. I love that, and that's the relationship that makes perfect sense to me. Wrestles with God, and I've certainly, if he's not there, I've been wrestling with someone. I don't know. And my favorite line in the New Testament, as time has gone by and as you learn about life, and certainly bereavement, of course, which we've both experienced as life goes by, and it profoundly alters your outlook. Is my favorite line in the New Testament is what sometimes been used as a swear word, which is Jesus wept. And I started to get the whole idea of God as a man when I went through bereavement, and I understood more about human suffering, and like as Othello said, oh, but the pity of it, Iago, the pity of it, the human condition. This is absolutely what this is all about. And Jesus wept. He was about to go and heal Lazarus. Lazarus was dead. If you'd come earlier, you could have, and he knew that he was going to go. Okay, you could. I mean, if you're watching this and you don't believe this stuff, fine, fine. It's you think of it as a story, but what a great story. That he was going to go and raise Lazarus from the dead. He delayed. Lazarus died. People were suffering. He was going to raise him from the dead anyway. He knew he was going to change things, but he saw in the meantime that people were bereaved and were suffering. And I think that is great. And I like those. So those are my two favorite parts of the Old and New Testament. Anyone who messes with those and starts agenderizing them, which is a word that probably doesn't even exist, and turning them into some garbage that's, I just can't stand it. I really can't. And that's why I used to fall asleep in church, I think, because I'm really sorry. I'm really not selling Trinity. I did get some good. I mean, people were very patient when I was there. They were absolutely fantastic because I was so ranty and everything.
Maybe we can do a list of apologies at the end.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, I have to say very much in its favour. In particular, there was a guy there, Alan Strange. Who, sorry, I'm not supposed to say people's
You
names.
can, you can.
And is that right?
Yeah,
Well, it's a compliment anyway. He won't be taking.
he's in the Netherlands anyway. What harm can he do us?
Alan, are you listening? I liked Alan a lot, and
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
because he didn't know what he was going to say at the front next, and he really enjoyed different perspectives, and I thought that was great. So anyway, there you go. I've rattled in like anything. James, sorry, over to you.
Not at all. That's what you're here for. And I know you, as you often have said, you're saying things that you've said to me before, but
Yeah,
the viewer hasn't heard this stuff. So yeah, it's definitely bears repeating. As you know, the thing that I was looking into the different faiths for at least 2 years before that night I told you about, when I had the revelation, and it was that the not the knowledge of faith and what the propositions are. You can get to a stage, I think, where your rational, logical self is fairly convinced of this, maybe even very convinced, but it's an emotional leap at the end of the day. And that it's being invited into a relationship, and the thing, of all the different religions and all the different types of proposition about God from the holy books, as I've said to you before, the idea that God, who, let's remember, created the whole universe, and as far as we can tell from physics, had it compressed into he spoke it into existence, and everything that's in the universe was once contained in a tiny pinprick of a singularity. That God, with all the vast space and time and the majesty, remember, we're all stardust ourselves. We all came from stars. That God would deign himself, would take enough interest to become a man in the backwaters of Palestine under a Roman occupation, under Herod's rule as well, and suffer and die for us. I thought at the time it was maybe a few weeks, maybe a couple of weeks before I got saved, and I thought, that's a God. That's not just a God I can relate to. I think that's the only conceivable God that I could imagine that we ought to relate to. Who wants a sky God who just dictates from on high and doesn't have any involvement with his creation? Nobody ought to believe in such a God, because why would they? But it's that becoming personal, where heaven and earth intersect in the incarnation and the cross. And I thought, that's a God that makes sense to me. That's a God I can believe in. And I was thinking back to the painful days, and they were interesting days, because there was that tension. We talked the other day, you and I, about a time when most of us in the social circle were single. We were getting lots of new people in. It wasn't a singles group by any stretch. Couples came as well, but it was that sense of adventure. And you talked about truth and about how people sell it and the language, the beauty of the language, and there is no greater adventure for any human, for any individual, than saying, I want to know what the truth is. I want all of the propositions that are put to me to be accepted as being true or false on their own merits. And I want to go on that journey and see where it leads me. It's an astounding invitation, but it's an astounding adventure to embark upon. And I think for those that don't know, we had a long period in the 2000s of, great nights in the pub, Jack Daniels, great conversations, night clubbing, women, after parties. It was amazing. But I think it's exhilarating, but we were looking for the things that are the most precious to us, and it's the exciting thing of never knowing who you're going to meet, but hoping that one day you'll meet the person you want to spend the rest of your life with. Just like I think people who take lots of drugs are, trying to anesthetize themselves against some of the pain and the difficulties of being human. And but as you say, yeah, it's true. The language is exquisite, and I know why they do it, and I'm not critical, because I understand that there's a need for it. But there are so many versions of the Bible now, and a lot of them are very watered down, and they almost read like a different book in a sense. You can track the changes, and you can align them and see which verses are what, but there's something so powerful about language. About it's the thing that puts us above, one of the many things that puts us above other apes, and that ability to we can beautify with language. We can explore the cosmos. We can understand each other. We can share experiences, share feelings. We can write great literature and poetry, and we can do lots of bad things with language too, of course. But it's all part of the adventure that we're on, isn't it?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I know we both appreciate. I mean, the first thing I asked you was, "Have you seen The Third Man?" And there was a third man who was the third who walks beside me, as T.S. Eliot more or less wrote. The third man, The Road to Emmaus, and of course, the third man in the Grey and Green story is. Sorry to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it. It's Harry Lime, the third man, and he plays with the whole idea, and he's down in the sewers and his hands coming up through the grate, etc. And it's fascinating, and it's fascinating, that creativity and the language, of course, because Graham Greene was a fine writer. It's creativity is, I mean, it's what excites me as much as anything, and to flatten that and to come out with. I mean, it's one of the things I mean, if I can be political for a moment, but I'll only do it for a moment. One of the things that horrifies me about politics at times, and certainly under this lot, who, as you know, I despise beyond words, is the focus on commerce and whatever, and the lack of focus on, or the disparaging, or the kind of sidelining, which has happened recently at the UEA, by the way. 31 out of 38 lecturers made redundant, and the 31 of them were in the arts, which is stupid beyond words. Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge, and other words to that effect, and talked about fairy tales and how important they are, and how vital it is for us to be creative. And language is part of that, and it's part of, it is proper discourse, as opposed to closing it down, using language like Rees-Mogg did recently, talking about free speech. How dare he? just when it suits him. Sorry, that's the last bit of political thing I'm going to say. I loathe this lot, but nevertheless, I've got to say that because it's the truth, and they're loathsome. But language, when it's used to great power, as opposed to like 1984, where you limit language down and down and down until people can't think because they haven't got the language to think with. But to open it out, that's why people like this lot are afraid of the arts. I think, aside from the fact that they know the value, was it the cost of everything, the value of nothing. That I'd say I wasn't going to say anymore, but that's the last thing. The great thing about creativity, and this is why it should be embraced and explored and used. Again, back to Emily Dickinson, to tell the truth that tell it slant, because like with genre, we reinvent genre, we reinvent storytelling to tell the same things again and again, and to go back to the stuff that really matters. And it should be exhilarating, and we shouldn't be afraid of that stuff. It may throw things on. We may use language that disturbs and bothers, and of course we do. Of course we do. It's in great literature. It's in Shakespeare. It's in it's in the Bible, of course, as well. And of course it's in there in Cormac McCarthy. War was there before man was. War was there waiting for him. This kind of thing. So it addresses violence and all the things that we recognise. That's what it needs to do. Something that people really get. So anyway, I always remember there's this line, and it's from Chariots of Fire, and I always have to reference something from a film or a book or whatever. And I love this line. It's a bit where Eric Liddell, if you remember, he's going to run, and he won't run on a Sunday, this kind of thing. And his sister says to him, "I'm worried, Eric, that you're meant to be going out in the mission field. You're meant to be working for God, and all this glory and stuff, it's drawing you away from it. I'm worried about it." Words to that effect, anyway. He says, "But don't you understand?" He says, "When I run, I feel God's pleasure. When I run, I feel God's pleasure." And I think that is, step away from the church, step away from people who don't get that. People are, it's varied, and of course it is, and that's what's great about life, that people have different ways. Some people need to have things this way and like this and this, but to see creativity and know what it means and what it can express, what it means, and how exciting it is, and then to put it in the context of faith, it shouldn't be dampened down, it shouldn't be limited, it should be something that opens out and disturbs and bothers, and that's the great thing about language, like you're saying. It's exciting. It's exciting when language gets you to look at things like faith again.
Absolutely, and there's a deep connection as well between your individual pursuit, your individual potential, and the search for truth, and the ability to have the courage to do that. Because the thing about people is that if you listen to people and you listen to their unique perspective and stories, you can't really fail to be interested. What's boring to me is when people are just parroting what other people have said, or they're a walking set of cliches. Because there's a term in economics called opportunity cost, which is they're not just robbing themselves by having this this very prosaic form of language and journeying. They're robbing the world of all the things they could be doing if they were to discover what their potential is. And we know in economics that you want people to be free to think and to speak and to express, because you don't I think I use the example in my book, you don't want the next Einstein or the next Shakespeare to be a carpenter or a long distance lorry driver. Those are very noble professions, and you can do a lot of good with them, but equally you don't want the long distance lorry driver writing the next great play if they're not a writer. And this is, you only find this stuff out by exploring and your creative potential. I'm amazed at what a diverse range of qualities we have, even just in one church, the church I go to. But of all the Christians I've met and all the people I've met, it's astounding to me that we have such a rich variety, so many talents, so much ability, and each used in different ways. As Paul talks about the different parts of the body, doesn't he? And I guess perhaps for us, it's probably a good segue into our main creative passion, which is writing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's great that we're having this discussion as well because we're very different writers. You're a largely fictional writer. I don't write any fiction. I wouldn't really begin that any at any point in this part of the journey. I might have a foray into it in years to come. But I certainly feel like what I do is thinking and getting that down on paper or screening these days. You know, there's something there's something nostalgic and poignant about the old style writers that used to write their stuff on typewriters and then pull it off and have it in their hand and put it into an envelope and send it off to be published, and then the book would come back. And you know, I think writing's been such a key part of our journey. Um, we probably should give it some coverage here, I think. Because I think I don't know about you, but it feels like an interesting season at the moment. We've both written things that we have wanted to write for some time, and we're at that stage now where we're exploring the possibilities. And I had an interesting discussion a few days ago on Stephen Bartlett's podcast. He's the I think it's called Diary of a CEO. He's a successful entrepreneur. And he's also on the Dragon's Den.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got this successful podcast, and he interviewed this guy. I didn't really catch fully what he does, but I just happened to see this. I think he might be a psychologist or a self-help guru or something like that. But I heard him say something which Stephen Bartlett then echoed, which was, here's this guy who wrote this book and it became a surprise bestseller, and all the money was raining in, and Stephen Bartlett had a company and he was offered lots of money for. I presume he did sell it, but he was offered tens of millions. And they both had the same thing, that thing that Bowie mentioned, you know, that the vacuum arrives with the arrival of freedom.
Oh yes,
So he's the writer has been trying all his life to get that bestseller, and he's obviously tapping into lots of human need in terms of wanting to do that. And then it lands on him, and he gets this big success, and he gets a podcast, and he gets blogs and all sorts, and everyone, you know, who follows him, you know, takes a big interest and makes him quite wealthy. And you know, the same with Stephen Bartlett, who sells his company, and then he can do whatever he wants, and he's got the financial security. And they both said that after the peak, or what they thought was the peak at the time of their life, the year that followed was quite anticlimactic. It was difficult for them. They didn't quite know their identity. They didn't know what they wanted to do next. They were on the high, and it seems that that's a very real phenomenon. It's part of the, you know, Camus, the part of the journey, and the prize is the journey as well as the destination. The struggle is
yeah,
part of the prize.
absolutely, yeah, come on, yeah, yeah.
And you know, we've reached this stage now. We've had a great friendship so far, and a magnificent 20 years friendship we celebrated recently, didn't we? And it's been an amazing journey. But I think both of us are now at that stage, aren't we, where we're hoping to bear some kind of fruit for our labor. We want to build a profile, we want to network, we want to have a following. And it's tough, isn't it? Because we're competing against so many other people. It's a crowded market. It's a very competitive market. How do you feel at this stage about where you're going and what's
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, as I said, I came to Norwich to study at the UEA, and I did a PhD in creative and critical writing, and it was yeah, it was good. It was really good, and it was nice to get that kind of affirmation.
Mm.
But so with some people it works out, they get a novel published quickly. With me, I think I still had a long way. I had to develop my craft still. Getting the PhD was very useful because I could start teaching creative writing, and I started with undergrads, but and then I started to learn what I didn't know because I didn't learn that much on the PhD. Strangely enough, not much at all, really, and certainly not about writing. As far as the writing is concerned, well, yeah, I mean that has taken a long while, and it's ups and downs. Things changed in 2014 for me because I was using a typewriter, and well, no, I was printing stuff out. But I have used a typewriter, and I would send stuff out in hard copy as you used to do, and it would be there on the mat with the stamped addressed envelope, my writing on it. And I thought, here's another rejection, And Stephen King, I know, went through this, although he was a lot younger. Rejection after rejection. They put them on a nail, this kind of thing. And it was really hard work. But I think there's a film called Eureka, a Nicholas Roeg film. I don't know if you've seen it, and it's got uh, Gene Hackman is in it, who's one of my all-time favorite film actors, and Rutger Hauer as well, and Teresa Russell, I think. And anyway, that's the point. Point is, this guy at the beginning of the film, or early on, he reaches his eureka moment. He finds all this gold. He's been gold prospecting, and he's so excited. It's like this great moment.
Mm.
And everything after that is anticlimax. Well, I mean, maybe this is an excuse for not exactly hitting the heights too early, but I like the idea of being slowly progressing, and with peaks and troughs, and things have got better and better. And certainly in 2014, I did well with 2 international prizes with a novel, but the novel didn't get. It almost got published. It went to one of the big publishing houses. They really wanted it, and for lots of reasons. And well, one main reason actually had nothing to do with the novel as it was. It was to do with marketing. In the end, it didn't get taken up, and that was a blow. And I got an agent, and she was fantastic. She was one of the biggest, most prestigious literary agencies in the country, and she tried to sell the next one, and as time went by, I started thinking nothing's really happening here. This should be surely, for whatever reason. And then me and my agent, who's great, we parted company about a month or so ago. But this year has been really difficult. One thing that had started happening was I started writing flash fiction, and
Mm.
I had some success with that a few years ago, and that's why I went to Edinburgh a few years ago for the Edinburgh International Flash Fiction Award, and I was shortlisted. That was great, and I found that was great. I really enjoyed that, and so I started writing flash fiction, but I stopped doing it, and then I started again. Anyway, this year things have started to pick up again. It's been interesting. I had another flash fiction story in a short list, and that really mattered to me. But more important than that was that I realized I was feeling sorry for myself, and I said, "You're gonna have to stop that. That's no good. You need to." I gave myself a telling off one morning because I was feeling quite down about it all.
Mm.
And I guess really for me, and then that very day I got on a long list, and it was Scratch Books, Scratch A4, and they're fantastic. I've got to say, I mean, I will sing their praises because I think I was then on the short list, and there were 6 of us, and I went down to Soho, and we read in this room upstairs with about 50 people in the room, and it was just the atmosphere was great. It wasn't pretentious. Because one thing I can't stand, and it can get like that sometimes, a bit too rarefied. The writing circles where
Mm.
everybody's networking and trying to impress, But that was great, and that was a real turning point. And then there's a novel or manuscript really that I've written that's set in Australia, 80,000 words, called. Oh, actually, no, I better not say what it is. Actually, I'm not allowed
Oh.
to say what it is. Yeah, I mustn't say what it is because it's on a long list for the Bath Novel Award. And if I say the name, then it'll stymie the what do you call it, anonymity. They've got a thing where they read them blind, so I won't say what it is. But that's great. I mean, there's 30 people on that list. I've got to beat 29 people to get to the top prize. I was runner up
Mm.
last time, which is 9 years ago, but it was great. That's what I needed. I needed that boost, but it came at the right time. Talking about turning points, and it just seemed the right moment. And I don't know what's going to happen next, but I do have a sense that things are changing. And I mean, I had to beat like there were over 2,000 people who entered this competition, so it was a big field. But I know that my writing has really moved forward. I don't know how interesting that is to anyone, but it has. I'm more confident about my writing, and I have been in the last like 9 years than I ever was before that point. And there's a point where I think we suddenly realize we're starting to realize what we are capable of, and that's exciting. Annie Prue's in her 50s. I'm in my 50s, you know. I'm not saying I'm Annie Prue, but we come to that point at the right point. And again, it's a fascinating journey. And I know that your writing is, you know, is profound and profoundly important to you. And I don't know where you are with as far as getting it out there is concerned, but I know that you're working on one that you're going to send out or something. I know you were going to get in readers, and I do apologize because I haven't read that chapter yet, but I will do. I've been marking. Anyway, over to you, James. Bye.
Yeah, it's part of the hunger, I think,
Mm.
is that when you get a bit of a success, what is it? I remember in Porridge, Ronnie Barker, who's giving Lenny Godmother, you know, the tutelage as a new inmate. You know, he talks about little victories. I know it's not the same as, you know, in our context, but just things like, you know, getting a tin of peaches from the food store and stuff, or, you know, winning a game of cards and getting a couple of roll-ups or something. You know, it's incarceration, and it's little victories within the context. And I think, you know, in terms of writing, I think it's been little victories, and I'm very grateful for them. But I think one of the best things that will happen if we do, you know, get any success is it also opens more doors and more opportunities for other things. I all of any little success I've had, and I'm very much a backwater blogger. Really, I don't have any other successes to write home about. But the little successes I've had have actually largely come from hawking. It's been, you know, me just asking a question, like Network Norfolk is our Central Christian Church site, and they didn't have a columnist. And one day I emailed the editor and just said, "Would you like me to write um, some columns for you? I see you haven't got an opinion piece." And he was like, "Yeah, well, why not?" I did that for years. Every week I wrote an opinion piece for maybe 12, 13 years, I think it was, which is a lot of articles. And eventually I, you know, wanted to go down, reduce it. But it happened by asking. And then I got some work with the LICC, and that was paid work. And again, I asked the question, I did the same with the Adam Smith Institute and the IEA. You know, and the Adam Smith Institute is a great place to not just write but network, and it's probably the UK's leading think tank. And of course, you develop contacts, and you know you get to know people who are in the public eye and stuff. And now I'm at the stage where, you know, I finished 6, but 8 if you include 2 smaller books. I've written a couple of pamphlets that are maybe 50,000 words, but I've written 6 books, and part of writing is then trying to, you know, reach out to people, but also in reaching out, they want you to have more of a profile as well. So I've got a lot of, you know, blog hits. I'm doing these videos because I think a lot of people don't read as much as they did, or younger people are brought up on podcasts and videos and stuff. So I love doing these because, you know, you can say a lot, you can cover a lot more. And imagine if we were typing this out in email, it would take, you know, hours to just get to this 2-hour stage with our conversation. And there's also the adventure of, you know, I don't have any notes. I knew 2 things that I wanted to talk about, you know, our journey to faith together and our friendship and writing. And, you know, what an exciting thing to just get involved in a conversation. Who knows where it's going to go, but it's bound to be interesting, and it could be interesting in any number of ways. And we've reached this point, and we've talked about lots of different things, and that to me is a worthwhile conversation. It's exciting, and I think if I do um, talks in public, which I hope to, if anyone ever wants to hear me on stage or whatever, I'd love to do the same thing. Just go out there and have a few bullet points, but freestyle. And there's that there's that quote. I don't know exactly what it is from Charles Bukowski, but it's something along the lines of, if it's not coming up from the gut, if it's not, racing to the surface,
Yeah.
then you probably need to not be doing it. And I hope the viewers find that useful, because having finished the books, I've been delving into different essays, and I've got so much sort of scrap material, which probably will be other things too. Like a friend a couple of days ago said, "Hey, why don't you do a 365 book of devotional stuff, and just one page per year?" I thought, yeah, that's a perfect idea for my scraps. But I've learned over the years that you don't have to just turn on the laptop or the typewriter or whatever and just write. You have to let it race to the surface. That's when your best stuff is going to come out, and that might work for different people at different stages in their life. They might have different routines. Some might. Martin Amis used to say, I think it was Martin Amis said, I'd write for 3 hours and no more. F. Scott Fitzgerald was like, it's just coming out, and they'll sort of algorithmically compress it into the best stuff. And I'll just, William Burroughs, of course, we know about him and his automatic writing and stuff. And I've tried not to be too strict with myself in terms of what I work on and what I don't work on. And I wonder if you find your best stuff comes in that way, or is it more algorithmic where you just produce stuff and then, like Michelangelo's statue of David, you chip away the stuff that's not David, and it comes. How do you what do you have a method, and how does it work for you to end up with the stuff you end up with?
It's interesting. I think, there's an analogy actually. It's one that my another friend, once said about the Beatles. He said that what happened is, I mean, as John Lennon said, no Elvis, no Beatles. But the Beatles weren't Elvis, even though they did do an Elvis voice sometimes, and it's like a conversation. So they needed that influence. So that's one thing. I need an influence. I need to be inspired and excited. And so one of the things I do is I will read something by something I haven't read before, and then I'll read something that I have read before by a writer I admire, like Cormac McCarthy, Graham Greene, sometimes Annie Proulx has worked, John McGahn, and and you mentioned Martin Amis, and I'll come back to him just in a second. But once I get to a point where I'm just thinking, I've got to write, I really must write, and then off, and that's usually when I'm writing long fiction. And Martin Amis said he reads until I mean, obviously he's not around now, but he said he reads until he's propelled out of his chair, and he has to write. So that's what I do with the long fiction, because it's a long journey. Obviously it's 80,000 words or so. With the flash fiction, it's different, and often I'll use images from pictures of, I don't know, from films or old photos, or I mean, one of the stories that did well was based on a car in the snow, and what I find is, who was it now? I think it may have been. I'm trying to remember who it was. It may have been Hemingway who said, one true line. I think it is. You just need one true line. I'm thinking it's him. I think maybe Muriel Spark may have said something similar. But one true liner. Once you start writing, then the ink starts to flow, and sometimes it works better than others. But what I do find is there comes a point where it's like, and you know, don't ever stop me when I'm doing it, because you know, anybody really, I just need to. I suddenly find that the words, it's like hearing it. It's like, you know, a transmission, and people will talk about this. You know, I guess it's the unconscious kind of coming in some way, stepping in, and I find I'm just suddenly writing like crazy, you know, like crazy, because I've got to get this down. So it works in different ways. Mentioning William Burroughs, he talks about the tonal and the nagual universe. The tonal universe is the universe of cause and effect, and that's where you can predict what's going to happen. And what the writer wants to get to is the nagual universe, which is the universe of chance.
Yeah.
And that's why he used to shoot at cans of paint, to remove himself as far as he could from the process. And the same with his not Naked Lunch, but he didn't do it with Naked Lunch, funnily enough, even though it seems that way. His later stuff where cut up and fold in, you know, and it's fascinating when you cut up a text and just move it, and you find new things come that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise, and it creates this sense of the random, if you like, and inspiration. And I think it's trying to get to that point, and there are varying ways of doing that. Like Brian Eno would listen to white noise or whatever, you know, hear this kind of this sound between channels on the radio, and that really influenced him, you know, for example. And that's that. So you know, it varies. I often say the magic doesn't work twice. You know, it's a bit like manna in the desert. You know, you can't keep the manna from yesterday for today, because it rots before. You know, you have to wait for the next day and for the new way of new inspiration. And some stories they come in different ways. You know, but it's Stephen King said he doesn't know where his ideas come from. He says he never knows. You know, I don't know. I know what he's saying. He's saying that in the end, you know, the thing that inspires it and sparks it off and starts writing it.
Yeah, Stephen King thought of writing as a kind of telepathy, didn't he?
Yeah.
You're almost having a conversation with yourself in a way. It's funny you mentioned Boas, tonal and nagual. I've got something here that I just pulled up from it's actually the epigraph on my book. And I wrote about the tonal universe is more empirically predictable.
Exactly.
Whereas the nagual is the less foreseeable, the intractable elements of reality that burst through unannounced and beyond the radar of prediction. And he says, and it's because he's borrowing from William Blake, he says, for the nagual to gain access, the door of chance must be open. And I think that's, you know, we need a bit of the unpredictable, a bit of the intractable in our writing. And I think it's remarkable to me how little I actually think about what I've written after. Now, you might think that's quite curious, because I write non-fiction. I write a lot of, you know, dense essays, and hopefully accessible, but it looks like it looks like a lot of thought has gone into this, and every line has been constructed to make the right arguments. I mean, there's often you want to seduce the reader with something in the beginning, and if you're like a truth sandwich almost, if you know, you want to state something that's truthful, and if you want to criticize something political, or if you want to criticize or critique a philosophical argument or whatever. But it's curious how so often what first comes out is largely what makes it to the page. What I do that I do need to review is I can only type with two fingers, so I think, and I'm bashing away with two fingers, and because I know that Word will have a spell check and the red line comes under, I'm not stopping for my brain to review what the fingers are, you know, churning out. So it's coming out. Then at the end, I'll go back and I will, you know, right click, correct any typos, and then I will make sure that it's stated in a way that's accessible enough and that the argument is clear. And I'm also not much of a perfectionist in that there are big trade-offs to writing, and that you don't want to spend so much time getting every single, not in my writing. In nonfiction, I can see there's more utility in that. You know, the line jumps out, and a chapter full of great lines that jump out is a fantastic thing in literature. But so there's something remarkable about the idea of processing these thoughts, and like I said, writing's the extension of thinking. And I think one of the things that I do, one of the litmus tests, I don't know if other writers do this, they probably do, is, well, two things really. The first thing is I try to leave something to go cold before I'll revisit it.
Yeah.
And one thing I started to learn over time was that often I'll write ideas down on post-it notes, and I'll write a little bit, a very small segment of what I want to write on the Word document when I get home, and I'll park it. And it's remarkable how often, when I go back to that later, I've got zero interest in pursuing that. Now, something ignited that spark to begin with. Something made the me of 6 months ago think, that sounds like a good idea. I want to pursue that. But then something changes, and I think I think it's partly that we critique us. I mean, you know, when we go to sleep, as you know, the subconscious does all sorts of interesting things, and it brings a fresh perspective the next day. Even just leaving writing for a few hours and coming back to it gives us a fresh perspective. You know, we can't just squeeze it all out in the session every time. The mind has to process and do clever things with it behind the stage door, so to speak. And it must be doing profound things during that period, whereby I no longer perhaps want to pursue the project. And it might be that I've pursued it in other ways, in perhaps better ways, during that 6 months in other projects. But I write so much that, and Zosha, my wife, is highly amused at this sometimes. There is literally so much stuff on those Word documents, so much stuff in those folders, that I can discover paragraphs, and occasionally, without a word of a lie, even whole chapters of books that I've stumbled upon 2 or 3 years later that I don't even remember writing. I'm thinking, wow, I've already covered that. That's great. It's like someone's just, you know, an AI has just fed me that as a gift. But going back over your writing as a cold stranger, almost as though you're reading someone else's work, it's a great way to assess what you're doing, isn't it? And a great way to, you know.
Yeah. It is actually. That brings me to, well, two things actually. One is editing, which is absolutely vital, and the other thing is on the editing front, I'm gonna have to go because I've got to go and do some. I've got to go to the 24-hour Tesco. A little bit of advert there for Tesco's because we're off somewhere.
The 24-hour Tesco. What
Yeah, well,
what time does it close?
oh, I think yeah, we're into infinity here, James. You know, when does the 24-hour Tesco's close? That is a really good line. So I just, but obviously prompted by yourself. When does the 24-hour Tesco's close? Yeah, that'd be a good line at the beginning. It could even be a really good title for a short story. I think, like, you know, the loneliness of the long distance runner kind of thing. You know, I like those kind of long lines. Yeah, editing vital, absolutely. Yeah, I must go in a second.
Trimming the fat. Was it Solstein? Was it, he called it trimming the fat, didn't he? I think.
I don't know actually. But certainly lots of writers have. I mean, I think of it. There's various ways. I can't remember the name of the machine, but when I talk to students, I talk about it's like when you've got grass, you've got a lawn, and there's this scarifier, I think it's, or something like this. This thing that you push across the lawn, and it pulls out all the moss, because moss has only got, you know, shallow roots, and then you've got these areas of no grass, but the grass can then grow more abundantly, but you have to keep going over it and getting rid of the moss so that the grass can grow. And I always think of that, that's a good analogy for writing, that you need to get rid of that stuff. And editing is a vital aspect without a doubt. Although sometimes, like certainly with flash fiction, sometimes the first draft is barely changed, but maybe that's slightly different. There's a friend of mine who writes poetry, and she's actually probably composing it in her head before she puts it down. Like Iris Murdoch, she'd write the novel, but she'd already written it by the time she actually put it down on the page. You know, so that's her process. Whereas someone like Brian Aldiss or Agatha Christie, they didn't know what was going to happen, and that was part of the fun of it, was finding out as they went along. That's not the same as editing, but
Well,
you know,
yeah, I mean,
and then they go back and and edit, and
that
or in Agatha Christie's case, you go back and decide who the murderer was, and then plant all the clues afterwards. Sorry.
no, no, don't apologize. It was me interrupting really, but yeah, it's I find that with several of my books that what began at the beginning was an inception that developed, and the thematic change somewhere along the journey. And like the Genius of the Invisible God that I wrote, that started off in a folder. I called it a very bold title, A Complete Philosophy for Humankind. I wanted to basically encapsulate what I think is all of the best and the most important philosophy in a great big tome. And I tried that, and it was okay. It was a good work, but I had a revelation. I had an inspiration to start to transform it into something about God and about mathematics and about the universe. And that happened. Then it was called God, Maths, and Munchausen was the title for a bit. Never going to be that title, but I just saved it so I knew what it was, based on Munchausen's trilemma, of course. And then it became the Genius of the Invisible God, and it's an incarnation. I think one of the keys about editing, which they call it killing your darlings, don't they? We can get very emotionally attached to our writing, and often it needs a quite incisive second or third pair of eyes to say, look, we don't necessarily need this, or I think it would be less is more. It'd be better, if we just cut that out. And of course, the writer thinks, well, hang on a minute, I've invested time and thought in this. I quite like it. So what I've been doing is the darlings I'm having to kill, I'm trying to save them and put them in another place, even if it's just a book of essays or something, or whatever it might be. But
well, that's what. Now, what was I going to say? Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, that's what happened with. I mean, the Beatles. That's the Beatles, of course. George Martin talked to them when they came up with "She Loves You." It started with the verse. You think you've lost your love. Well, I saw her yesterday, etc. And he said, well, I think what you need to do is put the chorus, half the chorus, and of course we remember that. Dum, 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 she loves you. Bang, straight in. Yeah, 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 and it's just half of the chorus, and then you think you've lost it. And that was an editorial. It was someone coming in and editing. T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. Ezra Pound edited it down a great deal, and it's the same with, although going a little bit further, Gordon Lish with Raymond Carver's short stories. It's certainly his first collection. What we talk about when we talk about love, and the sometimes the whole tone, and certainly it pulled out all the sentiment. There's a line, and I must go to the 24-hour Tesco, by the way, I really must. But there's a line, and I'm naming all these male writers just at the moment. There are female writers who I've got a lot of time for, but these just happen to be the ones I've got examples of. Hemingway. I read this out to my students the other night, and I said it's something like this. He came down the gravel path down to where the willows were, and there was the river roaring past like a mighty train, on its way to somewhere profound. It was a mile across, and remarkable and terrifying in its enormity as it rushed on by. I've just made that up. What Hemingway did write was he came to the river it was there. And I don't know whether he probably did edit that down, but that's in the Stephen
Yeah,
King book.
I remember that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he came to
it
it
was
was
there.
there.
Yes,
And
yeah.
it's the thing about language, which is it doesn't have to be ornate, although sometimes that was and certainly in early Cormac McCarthy stuff you can get that. But sometimes it's a very limited. It's subtext. It's what is around the language. It's about what's around the words, and to edit something down to its finest, and I think that's a fine example of that. He came through it. It was the, I mean, one of the problems sometimes people have, some students sometimes when they come along and they're first writing, is they think they've got to impress with the language. Well, I mean, but impressing with language isn't necessarily using long words and etc. And fancy phrases. It's often actually getting it down to its essence, which is back to what we were talking about, which is just tell me the truth. All I want is some truth, and
Mm.
that's the thing. Um, so so back to that point really, but I really must go to the 24-hour Tesco, which goes on forever and ever and ever. And just one last thing, actually, so one of the last things. Sorry, I'm signing this. Oops, I always remember when I was a kid, we used to, a friend, Chris Bowler, if you're watching this, Chris, he's a scientist. And when we were teenagers, we'd in Derbyshire, we'd lie in the middle of the road, country lane, not a motorway, and just look up at the stars and just be, like anybody. If you look long enough, you see more and more. And although I was short-sighted, that didn't help. But the infinite is there. The idea, we are the infinite. Is I've always thought this. It's you shoot a projectile unless there's some way of it. I don't know, not being endless, and that doesn't make sense either. We're surrounded by this the enormity of there are countless stars, countless solar systems potentially, and certainly countless suns, etc. And it's going at a greater and greater speed and whatever. I like that idea of that. What do you call it? The singularity, is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is it's nice to know. At least at one point it was containable. The mass must have been beyond beyond imagining.
Yeah, I mean that's probably a good point to end on, because
Yeah,
it's the in the sort of banal gritty matter of the cosmos, we are, as I said earlier, we emanate from the burnt out stars of yesteryear,
yeah,
which is a fundamentally beautiful image,
fabulous.
isn't it?
We are all made of stars, as Moby once sang. But yes, and I think that this is what's so exciting. This is why I just think search, seek, and be creative and take those chances, and why be afraid? This is, I mean, this,
Absolutely. Why be afraid?
what
Absolutely.
a great gift, and fail, make a mess, hopefully survive and seek it out and look for that thing that John Lennon was talking about. Oh, I wanted some truth. And you think, yeah, I know what you mean. And he was desperately wanting some truth. And I think, yeah, I mean that it's getting down to the bedrock, it's getting down to what it, and yeah, don't be fearful. Look for it. I just think it's just too exciting, to be banal. You know,
Absolutely.
do not make this banal because it's just too exciting. I mean, I know it's my perspective. I tend to be quite actually optimistic. I like the Smiths, so I'm obviously not that optimistic, but I do see the truth in the language, of the Smiths often, and that's why I like them, because I didn't feel it was like everything's fine kind of thing. But, well, no, it's not. I'm feeling really, not like things are fine, but it's in the human condition. It's there. It's in the
Yeah, I'm just reminded of a great Shakespeare line. He says, "Our doubts are traitors and make us lose the good that we often might win by fearing to attempt." I think that's so true. And yeah, I think it feels like we've just got started. You've got
yeah.
Tesco,
Yes,
but we can do this again, I'm sure, because there's so much more to say, and
absolutely.
it's a fantastic adventure, and it's great to be on it with you, sir.
You too, James. Thank
And
you for inviting me along. And
thank
I
you
managed not
so
to swear at all at any point during the evening, which is quite, that's probably because I was only drinking water. It's only water I was drinking, by the way.
yeah, I guess
And
that
that's only
means
because I'm going to Tesco's. Go on.
I managed to control my guest, did I? And well, I'll put the list of apologies
Yes.
hereafter of all the people we might have offended. But thanks, Ian.
Um,
It's been great.
no apology to the Conservatives or Rees-Mogg, by the way. But sorry, just to drop that little thing in there, I apologise not at all. But yes, James, it's been an absolute pleasure. And I'll see you in the pub sometime soon.
In, Indeed. Thank you so much, Ian. It's been great. And
yeah,
bless you.
yeah, let's do. Take care. Bye, James.